This is Robert Stearns. Hey, I want to thank you for tuning in. I really believe that learning is one of the greatest joys in life. And one of the greatest ways to learn is simply to have meaningful conversations, both with those who come from a similar background as yours, as well as those whose background might be very different. So my hope is that as we connect and converse with leaders from all around the world, that we will learn and grow together. If you're new with us, hit the subscribe button and we'll deliver the new episodes to you right away. So wherever you are, on a run, in the car, at the kitchen table with some coffee, welcome to the conversation. And good evening, everybody. It is Thursday night. It is our weekly meetup. How was your day? I hope you're doing well. I hope things are going well for you in your life. And where they are not, I want to remind you of the promise that we have in the book of Romans, that all things work together for good when we put our trust in Hashem, when we put our trust in the Lord. Even negative circumstances, when we apply faith to them, God is able to redeem and bring beauty out of ashes, right? The book of Isaiah, he brings joy out of mourning and beauty out of ashes. He gives us garments of praise instead of the spirit of heaviness. So I just pray that you're having a blessed day. This is one of our favorite times of the week, Thursday night, Bishop and the Rabbi, where we get to engage in the amazing miracle of this kind of conversation. You know, I was speaking with Mark Gerson this week, and he told me he just came back from our trip to Israel. Mark was with us in Israel for our pastors and leaders trip, and he was having lunch with Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik and sharing about the amazing time that he had with these pastors, 30 pastors that we brought with your help, all of our partners. We cannot do this without our regular partners. But we brought 30 pastors from coast to coast to Israel. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, who is such a brilliant thinker and leader, he said to Mark, you know, Mark, there's very few things in life that are truly unprecedented. We use the word a lot, right? But to really think of something that has never happened before, that's really rare. And Rabbi Soloveitchik said, the conversation, the friendship, the amity, the cooperation that is happening between Jews and Christians around the world is truly an unprecedented phenomenon. It hasn't happened in 2,000 years of history, and it's happening, and you and I get to have a front row seat in this amazing miracle. And I believe only good things will come, as Proverbs says, as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens his friend, as Jews and Christians grow together. Not in total agreement. We respect the differences between our faith communities. We even view those differences as sacred. And yet we engage in meaningful conversation around the vast majority of things that we do believe in and we do agree on. So I'm thrilled to welcome you tonight. Do me a favor, hit the share button. It makes a real difference in the world of algorithms when you hit the share button. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe and the share and the like and all the rest of that. That's what you need to do to help us out this evening. Super quick with a few announcements. East Coast Conference is coming up at the Tabernacle, July 14th through the 17th. We've got amazing speakers, Pastor Judy Shaw, Pastor Regan D'Onofrio from Upper Room Fellowship in Long Island, who is one of the pastors we brought to Israel with us. And now we got an email this week. He's bringing his first group from his church. There it is right in front of you. He's never been to Israel. We bring him to Israel, and now an entire group from his church is going. That's the pattern we want to see happen. Pierre Duplessis will be with us, amazing young minister, many, many others, Resting Place family. So be with us at East Coast Conference, July 14th to the 17th. Also, the Heckler Legacy Society, that is September 15th, 7 p.m. Prayerfully consider making a legacy gift to Eagles Wings by joining the Heckler Legacy Society, and there'll be more information coming out about that. All right, well, I want to get right to it tonight because we have with us just someone, you get around this leader and you feel sincerity, you feel authenticity, you feel depth, and you feel as though you're talking with someone who truly every day decides to get up and be a light in the midst of darkness. I first met him through Mark Gerson when Mark shared with me this rabbi's Yom Kippur speech. This was about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was just riveting, just so powerful. And he leads one of the great synagogues in the North Jersey area. And he's been with us before. I mean, his accolades go on and on, but his teaching and his presence is its own introduction. He's not a stranger to us. We are thrilled to welcome back Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz. Rabbi, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Bishop. I love your whole intro, and that trip to Israel sounded extraordinary.
You know, there's just nothing like the land, is there? I mean, you try to explain it to people, but until you experience it, there's a vibrancy, there's a feeling all its own that's there in the land of Israel.
There is nothing like the land, and the fact that Jews and Christians are going together. I'll add one to Soloveitchik. I'll say it almost sounds messianic to me.
Mm-hmm, right. Yeah. Rabbi Riskin used that phrase, you know, he really did that. And we don't understand what that means. But yet we should press into that reality, right? That we're living in the Bible is still being written today. It's the miracles of God. If we will open our eyes, they are present and we can step into them together. And we're honored to do that with you, my friend.
Yeah, I am too. Thank you for having me.
Now, I want to ask you a question before we start, because I think I neglected to ask you this question last time. And if I did ask you, it's worth repeating. So we'll go for it either way. But I'm always fascinated to find out, how did you discern your decision, your process to become a rabbi, right? Like, you know, a good Jewish boy, you know, what's, you know, the typical, right? You're gonna be a lawyer, you're gonna be a doctor. That's the typical joke. But a decision to kind of give your life to Torah study, to interacting with people, which is not always the easiest thing in the world, right? Like leadership. It's much easier to give a service to people because you give the service to them, you're done. That's transactional and you're done. When you're leading people, there's a whole different dynamic, and it draws on you. It's not easy. And yet it is very, very deeply fulfilling at the same time. So what models did you have? What was the catalyst in your thinking? How was your journey to becoming a rabbi?
I'm smiling because I just spent with a bishop and an imam about 2 hours with a high school class this morning, or a private school about an hour from me. And they asked the same question. And my mother on Yom Kippur, when I was 23, a long time ago, 30 some odd years ago, said, I'd like to spend some time talking to you. And I'll tell you tongue in cheek that I was very happy to have an excuse to leave synagogue for an hour because it's an all-day affair in Yom Kippur.
Right.
And she said, son, I believe that children know more about themselves than adults give them credit for. I said, I agree with that. And she said, I could tell, I was in the corporate world. And she said, I could tell that you are happy but not satisfied. I said, Mom, who at 23 is satisfied? And she said, I want to remind you what you said you wanted to be when you were 5 years old. And I didn't remember saying it, but I do remember the story. And she said, you said you wanted to be a rabbi on a motorcycle. And so I said, are you recommending the rabbinate to me? And she said, I am. And I said, Mom, I can't keep a relationship down for more than 2 days. I drink with my friends. I eat lobster, which is not kosher, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, all true, but you love God. You've always been a great storyteller. You were the confidant of all your friends. And I want you to think about it. So just out of respect and love, I said to her, I'll think about it, laughing inside that I'd ever do this. And 3 years later, I went to rabbinic school. So I do believe she's right. I think that kids are much closer to their souls at 5 years old. They're not cluttered with all the maladies of the world. So we just have a much closer connection to God, and we understand our dreams. So I was called early, but I just kept on pushing it away until my very wise mother reminded me.
Now, did you get the motorcycle?
Well, 2 years later, after that, when I was 7, one of her students was killed on a motorcycle.
Oh.
She then came home and said, you will never in your life. And she told the whole graphic story, and I've been scared to death to get on a motorcycle since then. So no.
All right. All right. Very good. Well, I mean, you know what? Following your mother's advice, always a good thing. And I mean, it makes me think of a lot of biblical stories where, there's a lot of interaction between mothers and sons, right? I mean, Jacob and his mother, Hannah and Samuel, and of course for us, Jesus and Mary. I mean, a mother's wisdom can be very, very necessary in guiding us.
I agree. Listen, and the wisdom of elders generally. There's Eli and
Right.
Samuel. So Samuel
Right.
never would have been what he, unless he said, "Go back to sleep." That's not your dream. It's God talking to you. So, so yeah, I agree. And yeah, she let me inherit the most important thing of life, was her spirituality and my avocation.
That's beautiful. That is just so beautiful. And let me just ask you then also this. When you were a child, did Israel play a part in your life, or what was the introduction for you to Israel, and how has that journey unfolded?
It's funny that you say that, because my parents at that point in their lives were very left-wing, which means very different things today than it did then. So
Right.
they were unbelievably anti-Vietnam. And so I was 6, 7 years old during the Vietnam War, and she once said to me, "You will never, ever, ever fight in Vietnam, but I promise you, you will always fight for Eretz Yisrael." And so I'm 6 or 7. I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to fight anywhere. What are you talking about? So yes, they were very, very connected to Israel from the beginning. We didn't have a lot of money as kids, so my father's first trip wasn't until 75. And then when I finished college, I announced to them, I thought it would start a fight, that I wasn't going to college. I was going to go to Israel for a year. And to my I didn't understand. They said, "I think it's a great idea." And I said, "Oh, you do?" So I had to find my way, and I lived on a kibbutz for a year, and everything that I knew about Israel in my mind came to fruition, and I fell mad. In fact, the only fight I had with them that year, we only talked once a month because it was so expensive to talk, was I said, "I'm staying. I'm joining the army, and this is it. I'm here." And they said, there was a big fight, and my adopted mother, you get an adopted mother on a kibbutz, said, you don't defy your mom. She says, "Come home, come home." So I've had this relationship that, it's going to sound so strange for a rabbi to say to a bishop, but I feel like living in America, which I love this country, I love what I do for a living, but I feel like whenever I'm not in Israel, I'm cheating on a girlfriend, if that makes any sense.
Right.
I'm so in love with Israel that while living here in the country of my birth, I still
Right.
feel like there's part of me that's missing because I'm not there. So what I do, like you, is I go an insane amount of times, and I just try to spend as much time as possible. I'm going to be living there. My son, we said off camera, is going to be there for a year between high school and college, and I'm taking a month of sabbatical, and I'll live there for a month next year. And Hebrew gets rusty if you don't use it enough.
Right. It's amazing, and I just love and we could go down this bunny trail, but we've got to get to the Parsha. But the fact that your parents were very liberal and left-leaning, and yet on the issue of Israel, they were crystal clear. And that is the beauty and the enigma of Israel, that you have. I mean, secular Israel is really, really secular, and religious Israel is really, really religious, and yet somehow they are able to coexist with mutual respect, really, with generally speaking, I think, without the kind of toxicity. Right now, we're facing such polarization in America, and there's such extremists on all sides, pulling one against each other. And of course, Israel has infighting, and of course, it's like any other country. I mean, it's not the land of the Wizard of Oz. It's got real problems, but generally speaking, they're able to hold together in extreme diversity with a level of civility and mutual respect. That's how it seems to me.
I want to go further and say that the liberals that I've talked to now in Israel feel abandoned by liberals in other parts of the world. Because when you think about liberal values, we just throw out a couple of them. It could be, inclusivity. Everyone should be inclusive. So the gay lesbian issue. So they are on with that. They're on with, making sure that there's equality between race and gender, etc. And as soon as they interact with those friends from abroad, they will be told, "But you're a Zionist. How can you be a liberal?" And so they have these, I'm sure you've heard the term intersectionality, right? So where the litmus test of, here are the 10 things you have to believe in, and if you don't check off one of the boxes, you're out of all of it. and
Right.
the baby with the bathwater goes. Let me tell you one other thing. Amos Oz, who was a very, very important writer, now deceased, if I'm correct, I think he's now gone, came to speak at my former synagogue and said the difference between, this is just when Israel and the Israelis and the Palestinians looked like they were making peace. And someone said to him, are you going to go to therapy with the writers on the other side, meaning the Palestinian writers? And he said, I have no interest. And they said, but you're a lefty. And he said, the difference between my left and your left is all the lefties in America want to make love and not war. In Israel, we just want a just divorce. And so the real politic there is just so different. And on the right, you find people who you'd think want to go out and, here you'd hear on CNN, they want to murder all the Arabs. The truth is they just want to find a peaceful solution. And not everyone, but, the right is not looking to blow up every Palestinian that lives there. It's just, right. It's the news stations. It's horrible, horrible gossip, if you will.
Well, it's a propaganda war, and that's why our work of bringing these pastors who have such influence, through social media and through their sermons, et cetera, why it's so important. Because honestly, you can't be in Israel for more than an hour and say, well, this is obviously not an apartheid state. I just took my COVID test with an Arab doctor, who's working for the government, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these myths that the media just, sends your way, they just literally like fog in the morning air. They just, they just fade away the minute you see with your own eyes. So it is amazing. And I love conversing with you. And is your mother still living?
No, she died young at 68. And she's the only one in the family that she just was sick for many years. She never made it to Israel, but she lived through every trip of mine. She was always scared. Every time I got on a plane, is this the time he's not coming back? But we lived through it all together. And if it weren't for her health, she would have been there. But she died still crystal clear about her support for Israel, always left of center in politics. And it's only, by the way, we're about probably around the same age. It's not shocking for those of us who grew up, in the 70s and 80s. It's just shocking if you grew up now. So it used to be that you could do both. But and people, the friend you talked about, who's a member of my congregation, I'm independent now. I no longer believe in parties for lots of different reasons. Mostly, really. But this friend that we talked about is very much right of center. But he and I work together constantly because I always say to him, you got to support the left that supports Israel. Because otherwise you have those who have the biggest mouths end up representing the left, and you have to have left and right. This cannot be a partisan issue.
I could not agree more. And that's why, people like Senator Cory Booker and Richie Torres, Congressman Richie Torres in New York, and different ones, they're doing such important work in that space. And, we can have disagreement on other issues, but let's cooperate and work agreeably on what we do, we find common ground on. So I admire that about your leadership, Rabbi. Well, speaking of leadership, this is a this is a parsha that deals with leadership and with the challenges of leadership. So everybody, I hope you've signed in. I hope you're hitting the like button, the share button, and join in with comments here as we get into tonight our parsha. We are in Numbers chapter 16, and verse 1, and we're going to go through the end of chapter 18. So Numbers 16, verse 1 through the end of 18. And this is the parsha called Korach. And of course, Korach, I'm old enough to remember the old Charlton Heston movie, The 10 Commandments. And Korach played this real role in that movie. And he raises up this rebellion against Moses. And we're going to see this. And Moses' leadership is challenged. Moses is this amazing figure who's, he's either fighting with the Israelites, or he's fighting with Miriam and Aaron, or he's fighting with God himself, because Moses keeps, going toe to toe with God, saying, you can't destroy this people. You can't turn your back on them, because your name is going to be besmirched. Your reputation, the idols of the nations will say, see, their God could not keep them. And so Moses is this figure. The poor guy does not get 5 minutes rest his whole life. But Rabbi, take us into this kind of amazing story and this portion, and lead us through the Parsha Korach.
So there's several motifs in the book of Numbers. And what's important to know about the book of Numbers, obviously in English it's called Numbers because there's a huge amount of counting that goes on. The first census that was ever done, the understanding that you start serving in the military then at 20 years old, who's a farmer and who's a publisher and every single job is laid out there so they understand how to navigate their way through the desert, with the underlying theme always that be careful not to count for numbers' sake, meaning that each person you count is actually a soul. So there's constant like sort of pushing at you. The book is called Numbers, but don't make anyone a number. It's like going to the Vietnam Memorial. You walk past and you cannot believe that you keep on walking and walking and walking because it's 56,000 names. And so you stop very carefully and you take in one soldier's story. So that's one piece of it. The other part in Hebrew, it's called Midbar, which does not mean numbers, it means desert. And so the other leitmotif is that the only way to grow, the only way to evolve, the only way to finally mature as a community is to go through a process. It does not, you've been to the Middle East enough to know that even by foot, it does not take 40 years to get from Egypt to Israel. But when you have a slave mentality and you're constantly getting into war and into internal conflict, you basically are not grown up enough to get to the promised land until you overcome that understanding. So the desert's a very important metaphor. But the third motif is what we deal with today is rebellion and what it means to challenge authority. And it's a really interesting approach that this Korach takes. Korach is very high up in the ranks. This is not a schlepper. This is a guy who is a Levite, and he goes around and takes 249 other chieftains, meaning heads of tribes, heads of groups, and goes to Moses and says, Rav Lechem in Hebrew. Who do you think you are, basically? You think you're such a big shot. Are you the only one that's holy? How about the rest of us? Why do you get to consolidate authority? And the reason it's compelling is because his question is actually a really fair question. After all, you and I are very happy to live in a democracy. We support Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East. And isn't it true? Shouldn't holiness be shared? Shouldn't democracy be shared? Shouldn't power be shared? So his argument is outstanding, but you get a tip-off by his approach. He uses the word vayikach Korach. It doesn't mean that he goes to Moses, but he takes Moses. He takes the people. He takes a piece of cake before it's cut. He takes from the cookie jar when his parent tells him not to. He takes whatever it is you're not supposed to take. And it turns out that his argument is excellent, but his tone is horrific. His arrogance is
Wow. I mean, just pause there, right there for a moment.
Yeah.
And folks, if you're following along, we're in chapter 16, and a Rabbi is bringing us right now to verse 3. But that just says everything, Rabbi, doesn't it? The facts might be correct. The facts might deserve a second look. They might deserve a discussion. But if the attitude, if the heart is poisoned, right off the bat, the issue is not the facts. It's something that's happening underneath. We've seen that, and you see that in this verse.
You see it every single day in front of us where we live here and all around the world. I'd go further. I'd say that he was intoxicated, that he wasn't drinking alcohol, but the alcohol he was drinking was power. And he wanted as much of it as possible. It was unabashed ambition. And I'd say the ultimate lack of humility in this guy. So Moses has no choice. Moses has no choice but to say, okay, now it's in public. And by the way, the Talmud, the major body of Jewish law, says that publicly embarrassing someone is equal to murdering someone. And he's publicly embarrassing Moses here. He's defaming his reputation. And by the way, because Moses is the servant of God, all of us are, but he's the servant of God, is also there's a sense that he's really almost like Pharaoh. He's questioning God here. He's not just questioning Moses, but does it in front of everyone. And because the argument itself is so legitimate that many of us get fooled by the tone. Let me stop and say this, that there are two foolish acts when it comes to questioning authority. There's the one who comes with a legitimate argument like Korach does, but has ulterior motives that are destructive to society. Then there are ones who are outstanding speakers who speak in the most polite tone. You think about, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, Louis Farrakhan. You ever heard Farrakhan speak? That guy, you and I can take lessons from that kind of oratory. And no offense to you and I who speak pretty well. that guy could outspeak anyone. But if you listen to what he says, he wants to
Right.
destroy the world. He wants to rip
Yeah.
us apart. But it takes a while to get there because he's so melodic, he's so poetic, he's so lyrical. So those are the
Yeah.
two different ones. The ones who speak with a legitimate argument and are despicable in their tone and their arrogance. Then there's the other side of people who have no argument, but speak so beautifully that if you don't watch out, they're going to sort of rob you blind right in front of your eyes. You're putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, if you will.
Which makes me think of the serpent in the garden, right? Like, I mean, he spoke very beguilingly to Eve, right? He was very subtle in his, in his deception. And so you have to not only be concerned about the brigands and the outwardly boisterous, but also those who come with smooth, silky speech. Let me ask you a question here, Rabbi, because I know that you draw, like, as you say, on the Talmud, on the Mishnah. Is there any extra biblical sources that give any hint to the source of Korach's, anger? It's like, is he responding? I was just reading beforehand that, the Sabbath breaker was put to death, a few verses earlier. So was he like responding to Moses allowing this guy to be put to death? Or was there a family issue? Do any of the other sources give us a clue as to why Korach, initiated this?
Here's the brilliance of the Talmud, and I would say here we go New Testament also. After all, and I hope this is not offensive, isn't the New Testament building on the Old Testament, right? So we're getting new learning.
Listen, I'm the first one. I tell people all the time, the New Testament is all Jewish. The Christian Bible is all written by Jews. So
I don't know. I don't know if you've had Rabbi Joe Potasnik on your show. Have you had Joe?
We have, yeah.
So Joe was very close to Mariano Rivera, who was the
Right.
famous pitcher, the closer, a very religious Mariano. So he came over his house and he brought him a New Testament, and he says, that's not my book, and he says, I'm the closer. So so it was just so Potasnik tells the story better than I do, but you get the point.
That's great.
So all of this is written. But it's not just being written to answer the questions of the Torah, the one you're presenting. They're also trying to answer the questions of their time, which is really what makes that extra biblical work so brilliant. So it's like what we do in our sermons, right? We're using biblical text to speak to the reality of what we're living through these days. So what was going on in the time of the Talmud was Jewish, not suppression, Jewish challenging of authority in really inappropriate ways, so much so that we know that the temples end up being destroyed, not so much because of the outside forces, but because of how internal our conflict was. And this was actually the rabbis yelling out to the Korachs of their time to say to them, be very careful. Like, you have legitimate gripes, but if you do them, if you bring them forth illegitimately, you're going to tear us apart. And you're going to see what happens. And of course, what happens? So skip ahead with your question, which I'll circle back to, is that Moses invites them publicly to offer incense and frying pans, which is not enough to see that God is not accepting their sacrifice. So what happens is that they are so intent on beating Moses as opposed to trying to mitigate the issue for which they say is their gripe, they end up being swallowed up by the earth. 250 of them are, and so jumping back to the Talmud, the rabbis of old are saying to their constituents of the time, folks, be careful, because the earth will come and swallow you up also. And you have issues with authority, that's fine. But if your issues with authority are really about your intoxication of power, then you're going to end up destroying the community. So does Korach have a problem that comes before in the Torah? Maybe, but it's almost not important because it becomes an archetype for illegitimate rebellion. And I want to make clear, Bishop, because I think this is important, that Judaism and the Torah itself loves argument. It loves challenge. Right. Now, after all, what does the word Israel mean? It's Jacob. It's one who strives with that which is holy. So I always joke that only Jews can define success by struggle. Life is so hard, so that makes you a real, because, and by the way, anyone who comes to study with me says, really, I can question you, Rabbi? I said, you're only a good Jew if you question me. Right. But it has to come with a level of civility and respect that is obviously, if Moses came and watched what was going on in this country today, the inability now, you and I, thank God, are showing the opposite. We come from very different worlds, and yet I feel as connected to you as I feel to family. Because our values are somehow the same, and I have no idea how you vote. You have no idea how I vote, But we want to share. We just talked offline also, and all of your viewers will love this. We're going to exchange pulpits. You're going to come preach here, and I'm
Yes.
going to preach there. And I'm guessing that our respective constituents are going to learn a whole lot about their Judaism, about Christianity, and about the possibility of coming together. So, so it's a very long-winded way of answering your question, which is the answer is I'm not sure. I'm not even sure if it matters. I think what we're learning is more about the trajectory of history here than we are about Korach and whatever he cared about, because in the end, all he cared about was being more important than Moses.
Well, Mark Gerson talks about the need for the rise of what he calls the principled center. And I just think that is, that's where we've got to rescue civility, basic common respect one for another. Like we have to fight for this right now in the public square, because technology, these, demons right here, technology allows everything to just be amplified to such extraordinary volume that the voices of moderation are just drowned out. And it's a danger that we've never really faced before. I also wanted to comment on what you said a moment ago about arguing, and even arguing, with God, that being within Judaism. And I said this on just a program the other day. I don't know, Ben, was it Torah Tuesday or Bishop and the Rabbi? I'm not sure which, but I've been pondering lately, from a Christian perspective, obviously Jesus is the central figure. Jesus, as I would say, probably Moses. I don't know if you would say Moses or Abraham, but Moses probably. Yeah. So Jesus is obviously the central figure, in our faith. And there's this penultimate moment in Jesus' life where he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, where right on the Mount of Olives there in Jerusalem, and he's praying this prayer, and really he's wrestling with God. That actually, now that I think of it, this is good. I'm teaching myself as I talk, because he does say 3 times, he goes to God and he says, if this cup can pass from me, please take it away. Speaking of the crucifixion and his death, etc. And so I guess in a certain way, he is having that kind of dialogue, that kind of wrestling with God. For whatever reason, in our Christian tradition, we haven't focused on that wrestling very much. We focused on kind of the final sentence of that prayer, where Jesus says, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And so there's kind of this sublimation of our will to the will of God, which I think is powerful and beautiful and right and righteous and holy, but also can lead to a lack of the wrestling that I think we see throughout the rest of Scripture, we see throughout other heroes of faith, that is part of a healthy relationship with God. I don't know if that's making any sense, but it's just been a thought that's been coming to me over these past several days and weeks, that so much of Christianity really hinged on that prayer, that I wonder if we've lost a little bit of what the rest of the word teaches us, that it is a right thing to wrestle with Scripture, to wrestle with doctrine, to wrestle with the modern world and holding on to our faith, to wrestle with God. And I think we need some of that more in our system of belief.
The problem is that we are now in a world that everything has been made binary. So it's either black or white, it's apples or oranges, and that's just not what the world is. And that's why religion, I think, is having such a hard fight, because people want the answer and they want it yesterday. And you and I would say, I want the answer. I don't mind taking about 20 years to get there, because I'm going to grow as a result of my journey. And I don't mean paying rent or my kids' grades in school. There are obviously blacks and whites, but not everything's black and white. And years ago, one of the worst funerals I ever officiated at was a woman whose husband had died. She was raising her 2 kids herself. She then gets cancer, and she then somehow lives 4 years longer than she should, but she finally succumbs to cancer. She's a very important DA in New York, and she leaves a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, and no parents. And the funeral is a Thanksgiving Friday. I'll never forget it. Her parents are living. Her parents are Holocaust survivors, And the funeral takes place. It's probably 1,000 people there. You know, all the important dignitaries in New York, as a Florida physician was. And I'm trying everything I can not to cry myself, you know, to not to be the one who loses it.
Right.
And we go through, and at the end, the father of the woman who died, meaning the grandfather, the Holocaust survivor, raises his hand. He wasn't supposed to speak and says, "I want to speak." What are you going to say? Of course, he gets up, he puts his mouth right up to the microphone, and he yells from the top of his lungs, "Why?" And then lowers his voice and says, "I snuck this girl through the forests of Germany. I swam across the River Rhine. I did everything I could to get her out of Germany for this, God. I rescued her as a baby and could have let her die back then for this." Then he's quiet, and then he yells one more time, puts his mouth to the microphone, "Why?" again, and then takes about 10 seconds and then says, "Praise be you, God. All my faith is in you." And that's all. I can almost cry as I'm telling you the story. And I looked at the rabbi next to me and I said, "See, that's the story of Judaism, or maybe the story of religion, which is that when we're in real relationship, really deep relationship, praise and rebellion, if and given in a loving way, are both permissible. In fact, even deepens one's relationship with God." So his question was, not why did you do this to me, God, but why in the world in which you created did I have to go through that and now this and now raise these kids? And that's nuance, that's subtlety, that's layer, where it's not just I hate or I love. Sometimes the people we love the most, we experience both at the same time.
Yeah.
Is it okay just to segue here? Because
Please.
okay, because what I want to say that never gets talked about at all is I think that part of this pericope, part of this piece of Torah here, is actually saying to us that Korach and Moses are not necessarily separate beings, but that all of us have Korach and Moses as part of our own beings. That when we look in the mirror, and this is the subtlety again, there's a part of us that's corrupt. There's a part of us that wants to argue for the sake of arguing. There's a part of us that wants to tear things apart. And then there's the other part of us saying, "Stop it, stop it. I want you to bring the world together." Real holiness is depth and is love and is compassion and is generosity. And we're constantly trying to figure out for Korach and Moses. And our job is, of course, is to let Moses be the one that takes over. But we shouldn't make believe that Korach is not a part of us also. Because then we're just casting stones and not realizing that we ourselves are part of the problem. We're complicit. You and I are sitting here having a beautiful civil conversation, but we lead in a world, both of us lead in a world in Buffalo and in New Jersey of people who don't. Which means that no matter how good the bishop is or how good the rabbi is, we're complicit. We have Korach in us also. And until we're able to say that to our communities, then people are not going to realize that they themselves act that way.
Yeah. So powerful, so brilliant. You know, I'm a fan of Carl Jung, of his, you know, psychology and his thinking. And one of his kind of groundbreaking things in terms of dreams was, you know, when you're having dreams of people, it's probably not about that person. It's about that person's part of you, you know, the part of you that person represents. And so in the same way, you know, you're talking about Korach and Moses, you know, I think each of us have our own Pharaoh, right? Like there's a Pharaoh inside of each and every one of us, and each of one of us has the Moses. And, you know, bringing this to Christian theology, I think the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, you know, Paul is very vulnerable it's the deepest angst that comes out. And he says, you know, I want to do the right thing and I don't do the right thing. And he said, and then when I'm doing the wrong thing, I want to do the right thing. And he said, "Oh, I'm a wretched man. You know, how am I going to be delivered from this body that is just in war with itself?" And I think it takes an enormous amount of honesty to get to that place, because we can live a superficial life of distraction that just kind of ignores the wrestling. But I think true depth and maturation comes when we're willing to go there, you know, courageously. And my goodness, that story of that grandfather, wow, so moving. And you know, for Christians have a little bit more of a developed sense of the hereafter than I think I've found most Jews do. But that for me is one of the blessings of a belief in that life hereafter, is that we will come to a time where God will make all things right. There will be a moment where there is peace, and this kind of shatteredness is found whole again. And the victory is just maintaining our faith and our hope in the midst of brokenness, that there is the hope of wholeness, on the other side of the struggle.
Well, you said that before I came on camera about people who are having hard days, and you use beautiful proof text of scripture to say, don't walk away from what you're feeling when it's bad. Dig into it, because the gift is not the horrible feelings that you have, but the wisdom you attain when you're there. So none of us are going to walk through life and escape tragedy. Something will happen along the way to someone, someplace, somewhere. The question is, what do you do with it when it comes? And the Hasidic tradition says that it's a real opportunity to actually nullify the worst part of your ego to open up a pathway to the soul. So again, you would never ask for the bad things to happen, but they're going to happen. And the question is, what do you do when you get there? It's called in Hebrew, bitul hanefesh. And it means, the literal translation is not good. It means cancellation of the soul. It really means cancellation of the unhealthy part of our egos, which is really important. Hey, by the way, do you know that the other piece that happens after these 250 people are killed in ways that are really tragic is that the pans are kept. The pans are kept leftover, and Aaron builds them into the altar, so that whenever anyone comes to offer sacrifice, they have to remember the story of Korach, so that no one lives that way again. There's a constant reminder in the altar itself. We're talking about the holiest instrument that can be used, right? It's the altar for sacrifice. That when you bring sacrifice, remember that if you have an issue with authority, it's okay. There's lots of room to argue here. Don't do it like that. And so it's a constant reminder. So instead of just disposing of the goods, if you will, they're not locked in an evidence room someplace in the desert. They're actually put into the holiest parts of the altar, which of course, makes us question what holiness is itself. What does Christianity define holiness as? Because the Hebrew is very simple. Is the Latin or the English, is there a word for holiness, that definition that you use?
No, and I think that I've I've been so impacted by Judaism that I would probably give you a Jewish answer, because anyways, no, you go for it.
No, so I'm sure you're going to say what I would say then. So I learned this into rabbinic school. It's actually very simple. All it means is separate.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Right, precisely.
So Shabbat, or Saturday or Sunday or Friday for Muslims, it doesn't matter. Is why is it a holy day? Because it's separate from how you live every other day. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, etc., etc. So, by the way, the Jewish wedding is called Kiddushin. That's what the ceremony is called. You hear it again. Why? Because any of us who've been married know that nothing feels like getting married. You say Kaddish for people who have died, the memorial prayer, because we know that nothing is like mourning those who we loved who have been lost. And so the point is that what is it? So Korach was not acting as separate in a way that would lift him up. He actually acted the way lots of us act in this world, which is, again, egotistical and maniacal and all the other things that go along with arrogance. And so the real holiness is not someone who gets up and toots his own horn. It's someone who goes to the homeless shelter and just quietly feeds. And so Korach was actually pretty pedestrian while disguising himself in being special or separate or better, but he wasn't.
Well, folks, we're having an incredible conversation with our dear friend, Rabbi Matthew Gewirtz. He's going to be coming to speak at the Tabernacle sometime in the future, near future, I hope. And Rabbi, our time is almost gone, but do us a favor, take the last just 3 minutes. We got to keep it brief, and talk to us about the budding of Aaron's staff, because this is this interesting kind of a part that's within in here. What is that? What happens there, and what does that signify? What does that say to us?
So it's interesting. It's sort of like this. Aaron has sort of this connection. I'm very nervous about using this word because it's not magic, but that's the closest we could have to it, right? The staff that turns into a snake, etc. Right. But so what happens here is, because there's a fight over authority, what God says to Aaron and to Moses is, let's let each tribe be represented by one of these staffs, and one of them is going to flower higher than the others, and the one that does is the one that's going to carry authority. So, of course, God makes it so that in this case, it's Aaron's, who, of course, the priestly class. And if I can be non-spiritual and scholarly for a second, what my Bible professors from rabbinic school would say is that these are the priestly writers themselves making sure that authority stays where it should stay. So they're writing to other crowds. But here, in this case, it's saying to Korach, or people who follow Korach, don't try this again. Now you're going to see this crazy, unnatural thing happen, which are these sort of these sticks that grow and they flower up, and who's goes to the top? But Aaron's himself. And it's a real tactic of magic in ways of supernatural flair, but it's also scary because, boy, if God could swallow up people and make things that shouldn't flower, I'm going to line and make sure that I act the way I'm supposed to act. So it's a strange piece of text here. By the way, you're going to have fun in a couple of weeks. You're going to have a talking donkey in a couple of weeks, right? So all the, Bilam and Balak, so you have all of these stories that carry with it this supernatural ether, if you will. And it's really meant to amaze, and it does amaze.
Well, we love it. And there's always that mystical side of things that is fun to step into, as long as we draw out the practical. Yes. We need the marriage of the practical and the mystical together, and that's what keeps faith moving forward. Rabbi, it is a joy. I just enjoy talking to you so much. You are a delightful person and becoming a dear friend. And we're so grateful that you're taking time to spend with us. Thank you for coming back and teaching us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I tell you that somehow, again, we've never met in person yet. We will, but there's a brotherly feeling to being with you. And days are long these days. I'm working really hard. Somehow spending an hour studying with you makes me feel like I could do another day without a problem. So thank you. You're a special leader. Your people are lucky to have you lead.
Thank you, Rabbi. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Stay on top of things for Torah Tuesday. Go to TorahTuesdays.com. That is our weekly study with Mark Gerson. We've been setting record attendance. I think we had 147 people live studying Torah last week with Mark Gerson. Be a part of that. Come with me to Israel, September the 27th. We are go to awakejerusalem.com. It has all of the information for our tour. We still have about, I think, 6 or 7 spots left on that trip. So join me in Israel this year. And whatever you do, wherever you are today, keep praying and working for the peace of Jerusalem.